Wouldn't understand, Matt. It's just business. You are a scumbag.
You wouldn't understand, Matt. It's just business. Those were the last words he said to me before shaking my hand with that trained smile. The kind of smile that only someone born to lie can sustain. I stared at him for a few seconds, and in that instant I knew the war had begun. My name is Matthew Cole, and I am the co-founder of Quantify, a financial technology startup that, until a week ago, was about to be sold for $18 million. Our empire was born in a basement in Austin, grew with sleepless nights and debts up to our necks, and when success finally arrived, my partner decided to steal it all. His name was Ryan Hale, a genius of appearances, a man who knew how to turn falseness into charisma. I considered him a brother, and he considered me disposable. The irony is that the contract he tried to manipulate was the one I had drafted, and within it, hidden like a time bomb, was Clause 14. That night, as the ice melted in my glass and the whiskey burned my throat, I realized what needed to be done. It wasn't enough to stop him from destroying me. I needed to make him understand the weight of his own mistake, and to do that, I would have to ruin everything we had built together. The city outside seemed to breathe with difficulty. The glass buildings reflected a gray sky, as if the world was about to collapse with me. Quantify was our dream, but it would also be the stage for the fall. What he didn't know was that the contract he had adulterated was the perfect trap. Deep down, I wasn't just hurt, I was curious. I wanted to see how far he would go, how long it would take him to realize he had dug his own grave. Revenge, I learned, doesn't start with anger. It starts with patience. The next morning, I put on the same suit as always and went to the office as if nothing had happened. He thought I was defeated. I just smiled, because in silence, I had already pulled the trigger of destruction. And while he celebrated with the investors, I went over the terms, line by line, word by word. Clause 14, almost poetic, created to protect the company from internal betrayals, and now destined to bring down the traitor. You wouldn't understand, Matt. It's just business. Maybe he was right, because what was about to happen wasn't just business, it was personal. The next day I received an email with no sender. The subject, read before he signs. Inside, there were copies of the adulterated merger contract with the Eastbrook Capital Group, and there it was, the digital signature of Ryan, approving clauses that removed me from the partnership structure. The betrayal was complete, formalized, and ready to be registered. The air grew heavy. I looked out the office window and saw the city pulsing indifferently. No one out there would know what was happening, a silent assassination of reputation and legacy. I opened a bottle of water, but the metallic taste wouldn't leave my mouth. I needed to think. That's when I called Emily Ross, my lawyer, and the only person I still trusted. Matt, do you remember the protection clause we wrote years ago? Clause 14? I replied. Exactly. I think it's time to use it. My heart raced. I had forgotten about it, buried among hundreds of pages, a complex legal clause, almost useless at the time, but one that could now become the definitive weapon. It allowed freezing any transaction in the event of proven internal fraud. Ryan had just pulled the detonator without knowing it. Emily came to the office that afternoon. She threw the papers on the table and said, "If you want revenge, it's now, but know this, you won't come out unscathed." I just nodded, because I was already decided. The destruction would be meticulous, clean, and legal. While she reviewed the contract, I stared at Ryan's signature. So perfect, so arrogant. It was almost a monument to his own downfall. That document would be the foundation of his ruin, and I, the architect. Deep down, I felt something strange, a flash of regret. I could just let him win and walk away with part of the money. But what is money when respect is torn apart? No, what he took from me was not negotiable. I deleted the email, closed my eyes, and took a deep breath. From then on, every step would be calculated, every word measured. The war wouldn't be declared, it would be silent, legal, and inevitable. And when the clock struck midnight, I opened the contract file on the internal server and let the cursor blink over a single phrase, Clause 14. In the event of proven fraud or bad faith, all operations are automatically suspended pending judicial review. Ryan had just signed his own sentence. The morning began with the sound of printers spitting out copies of the revised agreement.
Ryan entered the room with the same smile as always, the smile of someone who believes they have already won. "Ready for the big day, partner?" he said, patting my shoulder. I just returned a blank stare. Emily was by my side, steady as a shadow. She knew what was about to happen. I just needed to follow the script, wait for the right moment. The clock seemed to mock me, each second echoing like a countdown. When the Eastbrook investor arrived, everything turned into theater. Smiles, greetings, champagne flutes. Ryan presented the numbers like a conductor leading his own orchestra, and I, silent, watched the symphony of vanity. While he spoke, I took my phone and jotted down a phrase that had been hammering in my head. Never underestimate the one who writes the rules. It was in that moment that I realized something. There are many stories like mine out there. Betrayed entrepreneurs, forgotten partners, people who trusted too much. And if you're listening to this now, remember, sometimes the fall begins with a handshake. If you want to understand where this story goes, stick around. With every detail, you'll discover how a contract can be a deadly weapon. The meeting continued. Ryan signed the first document. I watched his pen slide with confidence.
And with that gesture, he activated the clause's mechanism without even imagining it. Emily exchanged a glance with me. She knew, I knew. The clock struck 10:42 a.m., the exact minute when the empire began to crumble. On the outside, silence. On the inside, chaos. I took a deep breath and thought, burn slowly, Ryan. I went to Ryan's office like entering a cold chamber, feeling the air conditioning cut my skin like blades. He was leaning against the desk, Austin dawning behind the glass like a sea of concrete. "Is there something you need to tell me?" I asked, keeping my voice dry. His smile was a mask made of expensive habits and shiny half-truths. "Relax, Matt. Sometimes you complicate what's simple." He extended a folder, feigning transparency, and I let the theater continue for a few seconds. From the hallway came the distant sound of keyboards and the ice machine crushing cubes for executive coffee. "Eastbrook wants agility, no drama," he said, gauging my reactions as if I were a chart. The morning light drew shadows in the corners, framing the lie. I approached close enough to smell his cologne and the stench of ambition. "You edited the control clauses and changed the distribution priorities," I said, looking straight into his eyes. A muscle twitched near his temple, a sign that the varnish was starting to crack. "If it's true, show me," he retorted, and I thought of all the basements where we started. I showed the mirrored document, the server logs, the digital signature, the timestamp, the IP. He averted his gaze to the view, as if the city could save him. "I warned you that trust was the most expensive asset in this company," I continued, keeping my tone clinical. He tried to laugh, but it sounded like swallowing glass. "Business is for adults, Matt. Sometimes someone gets left behind," he said, and that someone to him was always me. It was curious how his courage depended on an audience. Without an audience, only the echo of his own ego remained. "Today you'll sign as you always do, and every stroke of your pen will tell the whole story." He composed himself, realized I was already one step ahead, and tried a veiled threat. "If you expose me, we all fall." I smiled sideways, without mercy, tasting the metallic flavor of the final decision. "Then we fall together, but you fall first." The conference room looked like an expensive aquarium, glass walls, walnut table, armchairs that knew too much. Emily positioned the documents with the precision of a surgeon, while the Eastbrook representative leafed through numbers like counting cards. Ryan's pen danced between his fingers, a rehearsed choreography of confidence. I watched the clock, waiting for the exact minute we had predicted. When the hand advanced, my chest filled with a violent silence. He signed the first page, then the second, and the system registered the event like a digital gong. On the server, the trigger slept beneath the surface, discreet as a shark. Emily gave me a micro-gesture, a question and confirmation in the same look. The Eastbrook executive smiled, oblivious to the hidden mechanism. Then Ryan signed the third, and Clause 14 bared its teeth. The wall monitors flashed with a discreet alert, just a red border running like blood under skin. Transaction suspended, mandatory audit, precautionary freeze. The language of the law when it decides to be cruel poetry. He swallowed hard, feeling the room shrink a few centimeters. "What is this?" he asked, but the question already had an owner. It was his, not mine. "Anti-fraud protocol, provided for in the master contract," Emily said, firm as polished concrete. "Any indication of internal fraud triggers automatic suspension to protect the assets." The Eastbrook executive removed his glasses, surprised, seeking a moral translation from me. "It's temporary," I added, "unless the audit confirms what the logs already suggest." The word logs made Ryan sweat like someone remembering an old basement.
I sat in the conference room with Emily by my side, and the feeling was a chill down my spine, as if every glass surface reflected an anticipated judgment. She opened the laptop and, without haste, began assembling the timeline of events, cross-referencing logs, emails, and accesses, turning chaos into evidence. I proposed a move that sounded absurd out loud, and she smiled with the conviction of someone who had seen many legal battles. Act fast, act clean, leave no emotional traces. The idea was simple in theory and devastating in execution. Use Ryan's own signature against him, activating the clause I had written years ago as insurance and now returning as a sentence. As we outlined the steps, I felt the strange mix of relief and guilt, a moral mathematics that only resolves when the last paragraph is signed. The preparation was surgical. Backup copies, confidential witnesses, discrete recordings, and a media plan anticipating attacks. Emily advised me on legal deadlines and windows of action. Every second off the plan could mean irreparable loss, and I didn't want to be remorse in the future. I relied on silent allies within the company, people who owed me loyalty or simply couldn't stand Ryan's authoritarianism, and each small support was won with promises and risks. There was also the need to keep everything apparently normal until the right moment. Normality would be the curtain masking the imminent fall of the conductor. In all meetings, I smiled and nodded, playing the role of the appeasing co-founder, while inside I architected the rift that would split the company in two. In the scheduled draft, we placed the Eastbrook meeting as the central piece, the perfect stage where the spectacle of collapse would happen. We decided that activating the clause should coincide with the final signature to maximize the legal and psychological impact, leaving little margin for immediate remediation. Emily would handle the documentation proving fraud and bad faith. I would handle the public scene and contacts with secondary investors, and a third party would receive the evidence in case something happened to us. Over the nights, I reviewed my own character like sharpening a blade. I didn't want to become monstrous because of revenge, just determined enough to prevent the betrayal from prospering. The lines between justice and retaliation trembled, but we stayed focused, proved the fraud, preserved the truth, and accept what came next. When everything seemed ready, I scheduled one last conversation with Ryan under the pretext of pre-signature alignment, interested in observing his reactions and perhaps extracting a confession. He arrived jovial, loaded with easy jokes and the confidence of someone who thinks the world protects him. Little did he know I brought in my eyes the calm of someone who had already pulled the trigger. We discussed numbers, deadlines, and teams like two executives who still shared a past. I spoke in loose phrases, planting certainties and probing vulnerabilities. In the end, I shook his hand with simulated sincerity and felt, for a second, the weight of my own act, plotting the ruin of someone who once was a mission brother. I left the room with the feeling that the storm was armed and that at any moment the first lightning, the signature, would illuminate everything.
The big day dawned with the kind of silence that precedes disasters. The office seemed like a glass box about to shatter, and I moved with the determination of someone who knows every function in the theater. Edward Vance, the Eastbrook representative, arrived in impeccable attire and standardized greetings, unaware of the tension accumulating under the corporate smiles. Ryan was radiant, certain that victory was inevitable, and led the presentation with the predatory shine of someone who lives on appearances and memos. I remained calm, like a director watching the final take. Every gesture of his, every pause, every blink was mentally noted for what was to come. Emily sat discreetly by my side, ready to intervene the moment the logs demonstrated bad faith, the key piece that would turn the signature into a trap. The signing began like a ritual. Handshakes, phrases of optimism, and pens sliding on paper with promises of lucrative futures. The room seemed to hold a collective breath. Ryan signed first, confident, and the system registered the event. In that instant, our mechanism on the server detected the alteration and initiated the sequence we had prepared, almost like a clockwork trigger. The Eastbrook representative smiled and extended the pen to me. As I took it, I felt the symbolic weight of our entire history and the banality of the gesture that would change everything. I signed with the same hand that years before had drawn plans and projections. For a moment I thought of stopping and abandoning everything, but I knew it was too late for moral hesitation. As I set the pen down, the room was taken by a cold notification: transaction suspended, audit in progress, and the first noise of a legal mechanism that was no longer reversible. Confusion and denial came like waves. Edward demanded explanations. Ryan tried to minimize and offer guarantees, but the system translated into facts what had once been mere suspicion. While some employees murmured, others reached for their phones, and I felt the weight of the stares that had once idolized our success and now devoured the fall. Emily presented the extracts, the cross-digital signatures, and the internal messages proving the malicious alteration of clauses, drawing an undeniable picture. Ryan sought a public exit, threatened lawsuits, sued, and discredited, but the documentation was clear as forged steel: fraud, deceit, and attempted undue appropriation. In the silence that followed, I realized the victory would be bitter. The contract was halted, the funds frozen, and Quantify began to collapse like a house of cards before our eyes. The chaos of the meeting still echoed through Quantify's hallways when the news spread. Ryan tried to maintain control, talking to lawyers and yelling at assistants, but it was already too late. The legal system had locked everything down, and Eastbrook officially suspended negotiations, citing serious contractual doubts. The empire he so desired to dominate began to implode from within. I watched it all from afar, silent, as the trap closed with mathematical precision. Emily and I spent the following hours in an isolated room, reviewing logs and consolidating evidence for the regulatory bodies. Each document was a blade, each stamp a silent blow. Ryan tried to enter, but security barred him, an irony he never imagined living. "You've gone too far," he wrote in a short message. I replied with 2 words: Clause 14. It was enough for panic to set in. He understood there was no way out. That night, Austin seemed colder than ever. I sat on my apartment balcony and watched the traffic, like observing a river of people who still believed in the balance of the corporate world. I pulled out a bottle of bourbon, the same one we shared on the late nights when we dreamed of being giants. And now we are, giants crumbling. The phone's buzz interrupted the reverie.
It was a financial reporter requesting statements about the Quantify scandal. The ruin had a name and address. In the following days, news channels made room for analyses, opinions, and speculations. The company was the new spectacle of the week, a perfect case of limitless ambition and forgotten ethics. Ryan disappeared from the radars, and rumors pointed to him trying to sell parts of his assets to pay fees. Meanwhile, Emily and I prepared the final case presentation for the commercial court, confident that nothing could be reversed. The legal revenge was meticulous, almost poetic. However, there was something different in that silent victory. Among the papers, I noticed an emptiness that didn't fit into the law's paragraphs. No achievement returned the lost nights, the destroyed friendship, or the feeling that everything could have been different. Emily noticed and said, "Justice and peace rarely walk together." She was right. I destroyed the traitor, but something in me collapsed along with him.
Ryan reappeared 3 days later, like a storm re-emerging on the horizon. He tried to contact Eastbrook, threatening an international lawsuit and accusing me of deliberate sabotage. The statements were theatrical, the kind of narrative he always knew how to sell. But this time, the cameras weren't in his favor. The public doesn't buy a hero when legal blood still drips in the newspapers. He spoke of loyalty, misunderstandings, while the system froze every account linked to his name. Emily advised me to maintain absolute silence, but I knew he wouldn't give up. On the fourth day, I received an encrypted email from his personal domain. The content was threatening. "You may have won, but the game isn't over yet." His arrogance was his only constant. I made sure to reply, attaching copies of the evidence registered in court, and ended with a phrase he would understand. Some clauses don't get a second chance. From then on, he disappeared again, but not for long. A week later, an anonymous complaint tried to question the validity of the original contract, insinuating manipulation on my part. It was his last bullet. The attempt failed in hours, disarmed by the robustness of the evidence and Emily's integrity, who sustained the case like a fortress. The institutions had chosen a side, and for the first time, it wasn't his. The man who played with absolute confidence now faced the weight of his own game. Even so, I couldn't celebrate. Walking through Quantify's hallways was like crossing the tomb of something I myself helped bury. Employees avoided eye contact, as if my presence were a reminder of the disaster. I wondered if the victory was worth the emptiness, if destroying the enemy made me free, or just part of the same toxic cycle he started. Emily, always pragmatic, said, "You stopped him from doing this to others." It was a consolation, but cold as steel. At night, I received an unexpected call from Edward Vance, the Eastbrook representative. His voice sounded less corporate, more human. He said the company was willing to talk about a possible restructuring of Quantify, but without Ryan. "You cleared the ground, Matt. Now it's about knowing what you'll plant." That phrase stuck with me like an uncomfortable seed. I realized that maybe revenge wasn't the end. Maybe it was just the prelude to something new. The Eastbrook statement landed like lead at 8:17 a.m. Indefinite suspension, full review, public exposure of perceived risks. I read every word with the coldness of someone who had already rehearsed this tragedy in the mirror of conscience. Ryan tried to call an impromptu press conference, and the building turned into a hallway of echoes and hurried steps. On the dashboard, charts plummeted. Our servers registered cancellation requests and frantic messages from clients. I thought of the Austin basement, the first prototype, and understood that the past doesn't serve as a bulletproof vest when the present shoots. The board met in the big room, and every face seemed like a broken window reflecting fear and calculation. Some blamed me without saying so, others blamed Ryan out loud, and the rest just wanted to survive the day's headline. Emily presented the containment plan: transparent communication, external audit, preservation of essential jobs. I endorsed every point,
Even knowing that Clause 14 had made the implosion I accepted starting inevitable. When the meeting ended, I realized the hallway silence was a sentence and also a liberation. The press camped on the ground floor, and the revolving doors spun faster than our arguments. I received and refused interview invitations because you don't explain a fire by lighting new matches. Ryan descended surrounded by lawyers spewing trained phrases about misunderstandings and internal persecution. The flashes revealed the sweat on his forehead, and for an instant I saw the man behind the character. It was in that instant that I understood. Crumbling could be just, but it would never be pretty. As night fell, I returned to the empty office and saw the city like a board I no longer wanted to play. I opened the master contract on the monitor and let the cursor blink over Clause 14 like a funereal metronome. I sent the board my formal resignation from the executive position, retaining only the shareholder role. Emily read the text and nodded, without trying to dissuade me, because there were things the position no longer sustained. I turned off the lights, closed the door, and felt that no matter how much it hurt, that fall finally had an owner. The next day, the headlines piled words like bricks of a wall between me and who I used to be. FinTech in crisis, internal fraud, fatal clause. It was like seeing the story written in sharp letters. I received messages from old clients, some sympathetic, others furious, all tired of corporate theater. I replied one by one, without promises, just with facts, because false comfort is a new form of lie. Meanwhile, the criminal case against Ryan advanced, and the wheel of justice began to creak. Emily and I spent hours with regulators, detailing the chain of events without covering or embellishing. I own my decisions, including preferring truth to money, and let each word pierce me. The external auditors confirmed the fraud, and the freeze turned into robust civil action. Edward Vance called privately, said he respected the transparency, but Eastbrook wouldn't back down. The call ended with a silence worth more than any reconciliation speech. Quantify's internal networks turned into collective mourning, and hallways smelled of wet paper and bitter coffee. I talked to teams, guaranteed possible compensations, and apologized for the collateral damage of my just war. Some thanked me for preventing a worse future, others avoided my eyes because pain seeks culprits. The truth is, I understand them. No one wants to be a secondary character in a founder's revenge epic. Still, I preferred to carry that weight rather than hand them over to the continuation of Ryan's elegant abuse. At dusk, I walked to the empty parking lot and let Texas breathe into my tired chest. I thought of calling Ryan and saying something human, but there was no common language after what happened. I sent just one last message. What you called a game had people in it. I pocketed the phone, got in the car, and drove aimlessly, like someone learning to walk after breaking their legs. On that road, I realized consequences are maps. They hurt, but point to where I won't return. The Austin courthouse was packed, a mix of curious onlookers, journalists, and ex-employees trying to witness the outcome of the empire we had built. I sat next to Emily, and the wall clock's sounds seemed to sync with my pulse. Ryan entered a few minutes later, thinner, eyes dull, but still with the same arrogance that made him believe he was invincible. When the judge called for silence, I realized that hall wasn't an arena. It was an open grave for the ego of someone who never knew how to lose. The trial began, and every word seemed to dig a little deeper into the past. Emily presented the evidence with surgical precision, projecting on the screen every adulterated message, every manipulated clause, every signature Ryan pretended not to recognize. He tried to maintain his posture, but his hands trembled when the access logs were displayed, proving his direct intervention in the documents. The defense attorney stammered before the digital evidence stamping the blow. I watched in silence, without satisfaction, just with the exhaustion of someone who knows justice is slow, but when it arrives, it weighs. The judge took notes, the audience murmured, and the keyboard sound seemed like a verdict in progress. When it was my turn to testify, I took a deep breath and looked at Ryan. There was no anger, just a kind of mourning that revenge doesn't cure. I spoke about the start of Quantify, about the sleepless nights and the trust that sustained every decision. I told how I discovered the betrayal and how Clause 14, which he never read, was the safeguard that destroyed the plan. The judge listened attentively and noted just one phrase: legitimate protection of moral and financial assets. Ryan averted his gaze, and for the first time he seemed human. The silence between us was the epitaph of a partnership.
The verdict came too quickly for someone who had waited so long. Ryan was convicted of corporate fraud, document forgery, and attempted undue appropriation. The financial penalties were devastating, and his reputation turned to digital dust in hours. The judge closed with the phrase etched in my memory: "The contract is the word given on paper. Whoever betrays the word destroys their own name." I left the courthouse without celebrating, just with the certainty that justice doesn't bring peace. It just closes the chapter. Emily placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "Now he knows what you felt." The following days seemed too long for a free man. I walked the city as if everything were a distant echo. Cafes, streets, voices, everything sounded like memory. The conviction news spread quickly, and my name returned to the papers as the entrepreneur who destroyed his own empire to do justice. It sounded like praise, but it was a public scar. Emily said I should be proud, but pride is an emotion that doesn't survive loss. Deep down, I just wanted silence, something the world rarely offers to those who become headlines. I left the main office and rented a small space in an old building downtown. No security, no reception, just a desk, a laptop, and an empty whiteboard. I spent days without writing a single line, trying to understand what was left of me after the collapse. Messages kept coming: curious investors, insistent journalists, friends requesting interviews. I refused them all. Revenge had given me something money never did: clarity. And with it came a tiredness that even sleep couldn't fix. On a rainy afternoon, Emily showed up unannounced, carrying 2 coffee cups and a light expression. "You won, Matt, but you're living like you lost." I smiled with that tired irony that replaces confession. "I didn't lose, Emily. I just understood that no victory returns time." She looked at me, nodded, and replied, "Then use the remaining time to build something that makes sense." That advice, so simple, sounded like the first line of a new contract, one without clauses, just choices. That night, I reopened my old digital diary, where I recorded ideas for new projects. The cursor blinked impatiently. I wrote a single phrase: "Never fight a man, fight what he represents." I closed the file and realized that maybe the true price of revenge was lucidity. Ryan lost everything he had, but I lost the illusion that justice and happiness are the same thing. And perhaps, in the end, that's the kind of balance life always charges with high interest. The following months were an exercise in relearning. Quantify was officially dissolved, and the name that once graced magazines now rested in archived reports. I watched it all from afar, without attachment, like observing the ashes of a fire that no longer burns. The city continued its rhythm, indifferent to the fall of yet another digital empire. I, on the other hand, rediscovered silence as fertile territory, not of forgetting, but of reconstruction. Revenge had ended. The emptiness, however, was still a tenant. An unexpected email changed the course of the days. It was from Edward Vance, the Eastbrook representative who witnessed the collapse and saw, up close, the price of integrity. He invited me for coffee in Dallas, mentioning a proposal worth the reunion. I almost ignored it, but something in his message sounded different. There was no formality, just respect.
At the coffee, he was direct. You cleared the ground, Matt. Now you can plant something bigger, without ghosts. The phrase hung in the air, like promise and challenge. I accepted the invitation, not as someone returning to the game, but as someone deciding to play differently. I spent weeks developing a new company concept, more human, more ethical, closer to the purpose that once drove me. I named the project Iron Bridge, a perfect metaphor for what I needed to be, a solid bridge between mistake and restart. Emily, of course, joined the new venture with the same pragmatic shine as always. For the first time in years, I saw a future that wasn't born from revenge, but from learning. During Iron Bridge's first meeting, I looked around and noticed something I had never felt before. Lightness. There was no tension, no dispute, just a group of people willing to build something clean. Edward invested discreetly, trusting my new purpose without demanding power. "You lost a company, Matt, but gained a name that money can't buy," he said. And for the first time, I believed it. The past still weighed, but now it served as foundation and not anchor. Iron Bridge's first contract was symbolic, a small automation project for a local cooperative, without million-dollar figures, without haste. I reviewed every line like a ritual, reminding myself that every word carries a destiny. Emily approached, holding a coffee cup and watching in silence. "Still writing your own clauses?" she asked with a half smile. "Now more than ever, but with a difference. I learned that the one who writes shouldn't try to predict the enemy, they should predict themselves." When I finished the document, I added a discreet line in the footer, almost imperceptible. Clause 14. The trust is not renewable. Not as a warning, but as a personal reminder. Trust is the only contract that doesn't need a signature, but it's the first to break when power speaks louder. I saved the file, closed the laptop, and felt something rare. Peace. The kind of peace that doesn't come from victory, but from acceptance. That was the true closure of my story with Ryan, a period written in silence. A few months later, I received an anonymous message with the single phrase, "He's bankrupt, changed countries." I didn't reply. Not out of indifference, but freedom. I no longer needed to know his fate, because my life no longer revolved around his. The past continued to exist, but now is memory, and not prison. I had won in a way he would never understand, by rebuilding. One night, leaving the office, I looked at the Iron Bridge sign glowing on the facade. Austin's warm winds swayed the tree leaves, and the city seemed to breathe with me, in calm rhythm. I took out my phone, opened the Notes app, and wrote the last line of this story. Every clause is a choice. Mine, now, is to move on. I pocketed the device, smiled at my reflection in the glass, and walked down the illuminated sidewalk, for the first time, without looking back.